We're beginning our video lecture on another unit today on the concept of gender. So we're going to do two big things today. The first one is to distinguish biological sex, male and female, from gender, which is more of a social concept, meaning male, female versus masculine, feminine. Once we establish this difference, what we're going to do is talk about some of the bases by where gender is created, constructed. In the next video lecture, we'll talk more about things like sexism and some gender stereotyping, some of the issues that come up with that. But today we're just going to lay the groundwork for understanding the concept of gender as it is by sociologists and psychologists. So as an overview, we're going to start with several questions. The first one is, I said, what is the difference between biological sex and gender, and why are they not the same thing? Secondly, we're going to look at a variety of different theories that connect gender with psychology and behavior. And lastly, we're going to look at how these conceptions of gender are formed, and therefore what we're going to do there is mostly look at what is the basis of gender. There's a biological basis of gender, there's a social basis of gender, there's a cognitive basis of gender. We're going to go through a few of those just to kind of tease out how these things come. Now, gender is one of these things that particularly in certain areas of academia, there's a lot of discussion about gender and sexuality and how constructions of gender. And one can go a lot further than where we're going to go in this lecture, but I think we're going to give the basis to understand some of the things that why gender is sometimes a problematic idea and why it leads to some issues during the adolescent period. So the first one is to distinguish between biological sex and gender. So biological sex is basically an anatomic and physiological basis, which means males have one set of genitals, females have another set of genitals. They're different, and therefore these lead to different things, not just in terms of the anatomy, but also sometimes in terms of hormones. And by saying this, I'm not just saying there are just two sexes here. There can be more. There can be people who are hermaphrodites who have both male and female genitals. But just to make things simple, we're just going to talk about male and female as like kind of a biological sex. Now, this doesn't mean that someone has a particular is like, you know, anatomy and physiology or destiny, but there is a basis of it. So when we're talking male and female, what I'm trying to get at is just the anatomy and physiological differences. When I'm talking about gender, I'm going to talk more about some of the social basis, meaning like someone could be a masculine female, someone could be a feminine male, and that has to do more with kind of the social roles and the construction of like where one feels more comfortable, particularly as one comes into their identity during the adolescent years. So what gender is more about psychological and social cultural dimensions of being male or female. And I'm going to use the word masculine and feminine to distinguish them here. And these vary a lot from culture to culture about what is masculine, what is feminine. So for example, in Japan, flower arranging, which seems to be a very feminine activity, is something that's often done as kind of part of being masculine, particularly among the samurai and the warriors. Other things which might be considered more feminine, I'll just give you one example that came up early in American history between Native Americans and white settlers, is that, you know, the idea of torture and things of that sort. So one thing that Native Americans often felt about is that that white settlers would beg for their lives when captured in conflict. And they felt this was very feminine because a warrior is supposed to accept their fate more stoically, while the idea of like negotiating or begging for your life was a very feminine thing. Similarly, that very often that white settlers felt that Indians were very effeminate because they would wear their hair long and other things that they associated with being kind of feminine. So there were like the idea that this is rooted somewhat not just in biology but also in culture is what gender is trying to get at. And where these lines are drawn between what is socially acceptable as masculine, what is socially acceptable as feminine, vary over time and vary over place. I will also say one other thing about this is that just because there might be one conception or one cultural, let's say, dominant majority view on what's masculine and feminine doesn't mean that's the only one. There can be, as we talked about on the culture unit, there can be subcultures, which means that what is seen as feminine, masculine and feminine can be different. Just one other example of this, body piercings. Which might be seen as feminine, at least culturally in the United States. They become more, where you see body piercings, both male and female, and you can see in some cultures where tattoos, etc., are both considered male and female. So I'm thinking like body tattoos in certain cultures and things of that sort. So this brings us to what you might think is what's a gender role, which means at some point there is a dominant cultural expectation of how males and females are supposed to think, act, and feel in different situations. So for example, men are not allowed to cry, women are emotional, women are more nurturing, men are more aloof. There's all these different expectations. Some of this comes from culture, like descriptions in fiction and literature. Some of this comes from the different roles they play within the family. Some of this comes from just different ways in power dynamics, where by one gender having more power within society. One famous thing about this in terms of like Neolithic cultures is that prior to the development of agrarian civilizations, almost all the deities were female. Once you got to settled agriculture, almost all the deities, gods, became male. And so, for example, usually if you see early prehistoric cultures, you often see that there's an emphasis on the moon and the emphasis on female goddesses. And once you see agriculture in the settlement, you see a lot more dominant of sun gods and male gods kind of being in control. So this is kind of another way of saying that things can change, and differences that change in society can sometimes change gender roles as well. So that being said, that doesn't necessarily mean that biology is irrelevant when looking at gender. There are some things that are biological that are the basis of understanding gender. So particularly what for adolescents is that when the onset of puberty means you're going to have, let's say, an increase in hormones, you're having an increase in sexuality and sexualization, which means that several things are going to go on. First of all is that you're going to have the hormones, and some of these hormones are maybe typed masculine and feminine, but also the interest in sex means that people are going to find that identity more relevant and more salient than they would at an earlier age. The other part to this is that there's this idea that as you hit puberty and you become increasingly interested in sexuality and sexualization, you're going to think that the best way to get attention is to kind of live up to idea of what being a very best, and please note that there's air quotes here, there should be air quotes on the boys line as well, is that you're going to try to be the most female possible. And so what happens, you're going to see an emphasis of stereotypically male and female characteristics as, let's say, secondary characteristics developed during puberty, which means genitals, pubic hair, development of breasts in women, etc., etc. And therefore, what's going to happen, there's going to be an accentuation of these things, because there's the idea that you're becoming, let's say, you want to become attractive to the opposite sex, or you want to, in a sense, fit this stereotype in a way that wouldn't have been as important before. So, an example of this might be that the change in body shapes might mean to want a style of clothing. Some of this is some anatomical, and it's not that different people can't wear a variety of different garments, but the point is that there is a physical basis to your body, and this might drive, let's say, an interest in constructing gender. So what sometimes is found is that people tend to increase their stereotypical gender roles in the presence of the opposite gender, which means that women act more feminine when they're around men, and men act more masculine when they're around women. So in the sense that macho kind of male behavior, and also kind of the coquetted female behavior sometimes comes out in the debating and romantic interactions at this thing. And this is not saying about what your sexuality is. Obviously, you might be interested in the same sex, but the point is that you might live up to these gender roles when you're kind of in a mixed company, because these become more salient in differentiating yourself from the people of the other sex. So, for example, for females, this might be that women might be emphasize their being affectionate, sensitive, charming, soft-spoken, etc., while males will be more assertive, cocky, cynical, forceful. And the idea is that this behavior will enhance their sexuality and their attractiveness. And you see this sometimes in terms of same-sex relationships as well, where they might take on a masculine or feminine, even though both partners in the relationship might both be male or both be female. That there might be, let's say, still a gender divide in the roles between the different, let's say, partners in the relationship. And this develops at a certain age, and a lot of it's because hormones and the increase in sexuality and sexualization during this age period. So several older psychologists kind of a perspective that's usually called anatomy is destiny. And particularly here I'm thinking about Sigmund Freud and ERIKSON, who was a student of Freud's. And this is kind of the idea that, hey, if you have a certain genitals, you're going to behave a certain way. If you have a different set of genitals, you're going to behave a different way. You might want to call this boys will be boys. And so what Freud, and I think that this has mostly been discarded and mostly been disproven, and I don't think that modern day psychologists take Freud very seriously on this. But if you read Freud in the original, he talked a lot about kind of that males and females become fascinated with their genitals at a certain age. It becomes a way of differentiating themselves. Freud very often talks about cross-sex relationships within the family, like mothers and sons and fathers and daughters, about kind of how some of these things are set up. So in some ways, Freud is an awful psychologist by the modern day, and that where his theories have some purchase is usually anthropology and these cultural constructions of gender. But what Freud, terms like we may call what penis envy, because he said that that penis is like, as I said, I'm speaking for Freud here, is a superior genital, and therefore women feel an absence or a missing of this, and this leads to some types of their complexes that he talked about. A lot of this has to do that Freud's basis of his psychology is that human behavior in history is dictated by reproductive processes. You've seen a little bit of kind of, you might call a neo-Freudian perspective, particularly with the interest in evolution and like how different both animals and plants to promote, let's say, survival, in a sense, develop their sexual attractiveness, their plumage or things of that sort, and therefore a lot of the traits that we have, including psychological traits, are those that are evolutionary, let's say, adaptive. And so in the sense that Freud thought that this process of reproductive process is so essential, it's sort of come back again, but more in an evolutionary lens than it was, let's say, in the subconscious psychology that Freud is known for. The key part to this is that what Freud was trying to get at is that gender and sexual behavior are basically hardwired in. No one really teaches you about these things. No one teaches you about sex usually. Well, maybe in the present day, but the idea is that it's not necessarily something that's taught. It's certainly not taught to animals. And I think the point is that it's unlearned and it's instinctual. At a certain age, your hormones fire up. You sort of get an idea of what to do. And I think a lot of this is that it's hard to explain romantic attraction or physical attraction. And this kind of feeds into this idea that it's not something that the mind is developing or the mind is trying to understand. It's something that basically is hardwired into your biology, into your hormonal development during this age. So ERIKSON kind of took Freud a step further in saying that psychological differences stem from anatomical differences, which means the differences in your personality, your individual psychology stem from things in your anatomy. So what he would say, the genital structure in males' genitals are intrusive and aggressive. There's kind of a penetration, while females are more inclusive and receptive. There's a famous book talking about Neolithic religion called The Chalice and the Blade by someone named Eisler, and obviously the chalice referring to female and the blade for male, and the idea that there's sort of this aggressiveness versus kind of nurturing. And you see this in cultural displays and sometimes in ancient cultures, playing on these symbols and playing on these associations. And I think that Freud and ERIKSON, who were very much looking at early civilizations and other non-Western cultures, were starting to think that these were parts of universal psychology. Now, the thing is, they weren't really dealing with psychology in the sense they were trying to base this in terms of how your brain works or how your mind thinks. They were trying to deal with psychology in terms of narratives and stories that were found in cultural and some of the developmental steps that people take. So as I said before, this anatomy as destiny view has been mostly discarded and criticized. Even ERIKSON later modified his view, saying that women have transcended like their biological status. That ERIKSON, I think, didn't fully move away from it. What he said is that in the modern age, with the development of modern society, women have more opportunities, and this allows them to transcend like the limitations of their biology. And limitations, I think, would be more his word than mine. But the idea is that when you don't have to spend most of your life in the reproductive process, where women were having, 10, 15, 20 children during their lifetime because of the high levels of infant mortality and the high levels of mortality in society, they can, take on a much wider, spectrum of roles. While in the past they were kind of limited by the fact that childbirth and short lives and things of that sort kind of dictated a lot about their roles in society and therefore, influence and shape their psychology. So this takes us to kind of a second take on gender, which is a social basis. And what this is saying is that we participate in a variety of different social institutions, and these social institutions assign us different roles within the social universe. And therefore, once we are assigned a role, this role then kind of, in a sense, the role we play, the mask we put on, influences what's underneath the mask, i.e. our individual psychology. So, for example, what we're supposed to be is partly shaped by what other people expect of us and what other people limit us. And I think this is true in a broader sense, but it certainly has an impact in gender as well. So that the psychological sex differences, the differences we maybe can generalize between male and female, come from gender roles. Not that these psychological differences create the gender roles, but the gender roles are first created by society, and then our psychology develops within those kind of, say, containers. So, for example, just making some general observations, women generally have less power and status, even with the progress that women have made in the past century. They control free resources. They're more likely to be found in domestic work, less in paid employment. And just one observation that was made during this coronavirus is that 1 out of 3 jobs done by women was deemed essential, which was a much higher percentage than those by men. So things like working in retail, nursing, nurturing, are more likely to be seen as essential work, and also put women in, you could say, in harm's way during the current pandemic, in a way because of the types of roles, cleaning, domestic work, nursing, that they tend to form in. But the point is that these are stereotyped occupations that women are kind of considered natural for them to do. And on top of that, women receive lower pay. They generally do not have as many leadership roles, meaning serving as presidents or vice presidents or directors of companies. And so what happens is that women adapt their personal psychology to their lower level of power and status in modern society, or you could say society since the agricultural revolution. And so if you find yourself in that position, you find yourself to be more cooperative, less dominant as a survival strategy. And so the point is that if you become accustomed to that and everyone else like you is accustomed to that, there's a significant pressure to accept that as your personal psychology, or at least rationalize it. And then once rationalizing it, it becomes the way that you think, and kind of in an unawares level of consciousness. So what are some of these institutions that create these social sources of, and I apologize for the misspelling, these social sources of gender roles? The first one is obviously parents, that when everyone is born into a family, whether those role models are there. And these can influence the child's gender behavior because they see their parents taking on certain roles, and they either gravitate toward them as saying, okay, this is what I'm supposed to become, and I'm a small model of this, and as I get older, I will fill that slot. And that this generally perspective is called the social and cognitive theory of gender. And the idea here is that gender is a learned identity or behavior. And what happens is children observe their parents. And so if a parent is absent, or if a parent is not, in a sense, in a stereotypical gender role, this can influence how a child will view things. So for example, if your father is out of work when your mother is the breadwinner, you might have a different than the stereotypical cultural, like say, gender role for men and women. If you see that your mother is being more assertive and aggressive and your father is more soft-spoken, you might get a reverse gender role. And so what we find is that adolescents who have working mothers are less likely to have some of these stereotype concepts of what women's work. They're also more positive about women in non-traditional roles. And so one broader observation is that children who have mothers who are college educated, even if they are not working outside of the home, tend to be, let's say, you see children, particularly female children, um, have a much more broader idea of what's possible for them. I think also that you see this in terms of girls participating in sports, which used to be dominant for boys, is kind of changed their gender roles. And I've cited this before, a famous study by Betsy Stevenson, who was an economist in the Labor Department, I believe, in the Obama administration, showing that as Title IX made female sports more available, what you saw is an increase in girls' performance in certain subject areas. And so what this is saying is that some of these stereotype roles are not natural or essential, but the point is if you change, let's say, the institutions that surround them, they learn different identities and different behaviors, and this can affect their psychology and also their aptitude in different areas. So a second institution are peers, and about peer pressure and peer approval and disapproval, which means that if you act outside of certain sex type norms, you're going to have lower peer acceptance, which means you're going to be seen as being a tomboy and therefore not as feminine and therefore criticized by your same-sex peers. Same things if, let's say, you're male and you have maybe some feminine traits like an interest, I don't know, in fashion or dance or things of that sort. You might face criticism from your same-sex peers, and that, in a sense, either makes them less likely to step outside of the cultural gender roles that are established. A third one is school, and I'm going to start just by talking about one thing that I learned as a teacher, which is that when I was teaching in college, I would often use sports analogies to explain things like national identity and ethnic identity. And I talked about like the Red Sox versus the Yankees, that the Red Sox are kind of this is a time when the Red Sox were not winning World Series, that people were really loyal, and it's kind of a primordial notion of identity that you are born into this, no matter how bad it is and how much you suffer, you accept your identity. While the Yankees were kind of like you get rewarded. The Yankees had just won 4 World Series, and you get rewarded for your choice of identity, and so you tend to take on identities that yield positive results. And a female student came up to me, and I think this is something that I would ask these questions because I would try to improve my practice. But she said, like when you use sports analogies, it makes it harder, or I feel not included in the discussion because you're mostly talking to the male students in the room. And I think this happens very subtly for a lot of teachers, which is that you tend to talk to some students more than others by, in a sense, staying in your gender roles. And so when you try to explain things, you sometimes need to explain things in a variety of different ways, and so that both boys and girls can both kind of latch on to the material rather than using kind of one approach to it, or even just one more assertive. I also found this sometimes as more competitive versus more cooperative activities, that some people do not like competitive activities and therefore they tune out of the learning, while some are like more cooperative activities and they're more engaged in the learning. So what we find in general is that learning problems for girls are not identified as much as they are for boys. And if you looked at special education, you still find that it's more likely to be 2 to 1 male to female about people who are identified as having learning problems. And part of this is that boys' behavior, boys' atypical behavior, is either seen as clearer, meaning like more manifest, but also that learning disabilities are more important. Learning disabilities are more important for boys because learning is more important because they're expected to go on in their education, to go to college, etc. While girls, maybe, and I'm talking about a stereotypical way, have to be pretty and get married. So if they're not too bright, that's not necessarily seen as a problem. But it is a problem when schools systematically do not identify the learning disabilities and learning struggles that girls have in school. A second part of this is that girls almost always do better in school at younger ages. So in elementary school, well into early middle school, you see girls test higher than boys, get higher grades, do better on standardized tests. But by the time that you reach high school graduation, they score lower on SAT exams and standardized tests, and are more like they used to be less likely to go to college, although that has reversed in the last 2 decades, which means there are more women in college now than boys in the entering cohorts. And the one last one is that boys are often likely to see attention because they're more assertive, they raise their hands more. And they even did a study of students and asking which students are the brightest in their class. And what happened is that most students, both male and female, are more likely to nominate their male peers as the best students in the class versus their female peers, even when the female peers do significantly better in terms of, let's say, objective demonstrations of their ability. And so there's a lot of things going on in how, particularly just the idea of calling out and participating might be biased toward one versus the other. But the thing is that it also creates different roles, which means that school rewards boys for being aggressive and sometimes being rude in terms of how they interact in class, and punishes girls for the same behavior, while girls are kind of sometimes rewarded, which means reward in the sense that girls' behavior, like for example, female bullying, I think gets less identified in school situations than male bullying. And as a result, female bullying is not addressed as well as it should be, while male bullying tends to be the core of what we think of when we think about bullying in the school environment. So Myra and David Seidker find that most educators are unaware, because these are not it's not deliberative. It's not because the teacher says, well, I favor one gender over the other. There's a lot of subtle ways, and I brought up my own example about just using certain analogies to explain something that can be biased toward one gender versus the other based on their experience. Now, I think things are changing, which means that when I was teaching in the early 1990s, using sports analogies was probably something that biased toward male students, but as more women become interested in sports and participate in sports, maybe that's not as discriminatory as it would have been in the past. And I think also and my wife, who is an engineer, which is a very male-dominated field, very often females feel they don't belong. One thing that my wife sometimes complains about as a female professor is that she's treated as if she's like a spouse, and therefore she sometimes has to attend the spouse events, and she's treated, and even though she's a full-time professor and has all those responsibilities, she's treated as being kind of the support staff for the department. And I think this is something that women experience in a lot of different ways. My advisor in college did a study of what was called the T-Pores Rebellion in Japanese society, where even if you're the head of your section, even if you're the president of your company in Japan, the female is expected to pour tea. So the point is, even though you're higher up in the ranking, you're higher status, you have to do the subservient activities like serve everyone tea, including the people who are below you. And this was felt to be very discriminatory, and my advisor studied a situation where women refused to pour tea, which means they basically said, look, this shouldn't be expected of us. We are kind of executives or supervisors. We shouldn't have to serve, let's say, our underlings because it's not reversed. So I think that's an important another way of thinking, that females often don't see the role models, and as a result they feel isolated, and sometimes they don't continue even when they clearly have the ability and are superior to their male peers. One other area where you see this is mass media, which is that mass media and particularly situation comedies rely upon using stereotypes, because that's how you create a joke, is playing off the expectation of the audience. And so you see sometimes these jokes being kind of ingrained by, in a sense, reifying or emphasizing these stereotypes. So you see characters where teenage girls are shown as being ditzy, interested in dating and shopping and their appearance, much more, while men are kind of more likely portrayed in, let's say, serious or more professional roles. Attractive girls are often portrayed as being airheads, like the idea of a dumb blonde. The movie Legally Blonde, I think, illustrates this very well. While intelligent girls are often typecast as being unattractive. So if someone is, if I want to communicate that someone's intelligent in a character, what you'll do is, in a sense, dress her up and put her in costume. That makes her seem less attractive, and therefore these associations kind of are mediated and are kind of sent to us through kind of like the media that we consume. You see this in terms of music videos, which would be more important in the previous generation than now, but women are being acted as sexually aggressive and, flaunting their sexuality, and sometimes in ways that are denigrating to women. And you see that, and as someone of the mentee generation, is that music videos are often constructed from the teenage boy's perspective, which means a lot of, let's say, um, heavy in sexuality, very much like men are the center of attention, women dancers hanging over the overly male band, um, and you don't see this as much. And one way that you might see this in just terms of media, in Japan you have a variety of different comic books, and they have what are called adolescent male comic books and also adolescent female comic books, usually called in Japanese terms shonen and shoujo. Shonen meaning for young boys and shoujo meaning for young girls. And the point is that the plot lines that you see in some of these are more likely to feature strong female characters or plot lines that are more interesting to adolescent girls than adolescent boys. But there's kind of a segregation of this. And what you see sometimes in American culture is only kind of the teenage boys' kind of view of the world or what they're interested in. And as a result, it's not attractive, but also kind of reemphasizes kind of certain social expectations. So the last basis of gender is a cognitive base of gender. And so I'm going to talk about a few theories that cognitive means like how your mind organizes your experience, which means this is not about social roles. This is not about your physical body. This is more about how your brain works. And your brain tries to put things into categories, and your brain tries to organize all the information you're taking in into different categories. So there, a very famous anthropological study is called primitive classification by Emile Durkheim and Marcel Mauss. And what they said is that the simplest way that we organize the universe is male and female, left and right, yin and yang. And you see this as basically when you, in a sense, create dualities. These dualities are often gendered male and female, and then your brain, becomes very useful for your brain to kind of organize your experience of the world into these gender categories. And so particularly people have talked about in the Western world, the kind of active and passive being male and female, the idea of cause and effect has a very much of a gendered aspect to that. If you ever read Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince, the word virtue, for instance, in The Prince, virtu, literally means manliness. The word vir is Latin for male. Virtue is a male characteristic. Women are not virtuous, only men are. And you see a lot of this in terms of language where words that are based in male terms are generally considered positive, and like things like hysterical or histrionics are things that have female word roots that refer to like hysteria is based in the Greek word for female. And so the point is that positive things are associated with male behavior, negative things are associated with female behavior. But I mentioned Machiavelli before, and in The Prince, they say something like the person of virtue is a male who literally takes a woman, nature, by the throat and shakes her until the woman does his bidding. And this is the idea of, let's say, an assertive, good leader in the terms of Machiavelli, the 1500s. Now, obviously, this is not a very modern, progressive way of viewing the world, but the idea is that things are given gendered basis. Like, for example, we talk about Mother Nature. Very often, things like ships are named after women. Instruments, musical instruments, are named after women very often. And so that what happens is that we give things a gendered pallor to them, and this affects how our brain processes things, even when gender is not a thing. So a lot of these are based on cognitive, based on Piaget and Kohlberg, which have stage theories about how your mind develops from along the way. And what they would say that it goes something like this, is that, once you understand that there are different genders, you identify with one versus the other, like, i.e. you put yourself into a category and you put other people into a category. So a young girl might say something like, I am a girl, I want to do girl things, therefore the opportunity to do girl things is rewarding. So because you're a girl, you want to fit what that is, you want to fit that, and therefore you gravitate toward things that are seen as being girl things, i.e. shopping, cooking, etc. And what happens is that your mind strives toward consistency, which means if I'm in this category, my behavior should fit this category. And when your behavior doesn't fit the category, there's a conflict in there, and that creates kind of a cognitive dissonance. And the idea here is that what your brain is trying to do is rationalize your behavior in terms of these categories about how to organize the world. Another way of looking at this is what's called gender schema theory. And let me start about what a schema is. A schema is just a framework that uses the kind of filters and processes information. So a schema is just an organizational mechanism, and they can be, formal, and they can be informal. They can be aware or unaware, but your mind puts things into categories. And so your attention and behavior are guided by these motivations to conform to these gender categories provided by your culture. But the point is, it's not because there's a narrative in the culture, it's not because of media or social institutions, it's because your brain is shaped by being part of society, and therefore you take these categories and you adopt them. And so what gender schema is saying is that you organize the world in terms of male and female. And I talked a little bit about this before, that, when we talk about yin and yang are male and female, positive and negative, light and dark. And so these idea of oppositions are sometimes gendered as being male and female, even though that's not necessarily meaning that they are male or female. So what gender schema gets into the idea of gender stereotyping, which is that the world is complex, there's a lot of information out there, and we stereotype because it allows us to simplify this complexity and allows us then, once simplifying it, to abstract it and think about it in a useful way. But the problem with it is that even though this is just kind of a simplification mechanism, sometimes we take these labels and give them more of a reality than they really have, and therefore the labels become more real than the actual lived experience that we have. So it's hard to abandon these labels after they serve the purpose of simplifying reality. And so what you have is, you have these stereotypes where men are perceived as being dominant, independent, aggressive, achievement-oriented, while women are seen as nurturing, affiliated, and are lower esteem. And so what happens is that we set the expectations, and then we expect things to fall into these categories. And it's more, let's say, at the cognitive level of the brain this occurs. So this is where I'm going to wrap up for this video lecture. And the next video lecture, we'll talk a little bit more about the problems of sexism and gender stereotyping.